Spring Web is the most popular of all of the projects that get added to a Spring Boot application. And the reason for that comes down to just three letters, M, V, and C, or more specifically, Spring MVC, which is Spring's server-side rendering technology. And I know what you're thinking. All of the cool kids are doing Angular or React or Vue. But the fact is, if you're in a high-paying industry like insurance, like banking, or government, server-side rendering is very, very important. And that's why I put this Spring MVC tutorial together for you. And to be honest with you, I think of it more as a journey into all of the amazing things that Spring MVC can do, as opposed to it just being a crash course or a tutorial. If you stick around for just about an hour or so, and pro tip for you, if you play these videos on 2x speeds, I tend to pronunciate my words well, so you can usually keep up with it. But if you stick around for the next hour or so, 2x speed or regular speed, we're going to cover all of the important parts of Spring MVC, including the controller annotation, ResponseBody, GetMapping, request parameters, ResponseBody for creating RESTful APIs, because we're going to take a look at that with Spring MVC. We'll take a look at templating engines like Timely. We'll take a look at Spring Data and Spring JDBC, because we want to take some data and actually persist it to a database. And the database that we're going to use is the embedded H2, so we'll take a look at that. And furthermore, if you follow on some of the tutorials that come after this one, you'll learn how to Dockerize a Spring Boot application and even push it up to AWS and Fargate. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at TheServerSide.com, and I have to be one of the world's biggest Spring Boot advocates. And one of the Spring technologies that I've loved for a very long time is Spring MVC. I must be doing it for coming up to 15, almost 20 years. And that's why I put this tutorial, journey together for you, because I want to teach you everything that I know about Spring MVC, starting with what Model View Controller is and how Model View Controller works in the world of Spring. And that is what we're going to do next. Anyone who subscribes to my YouTube channel, and you should subscribe to my YouTube channel, knows that I'm not big on theory. I like to code. I've always embraced that agile tenet of working software over comprehensive documentation. But I do think we need to talk a little bit about what MVC is, how that applies to Spring MVC, and the different pieces that we're going to put together in this Spring MVC application that we're going to build. Now, one thing I will say to you, there will be a time marker for when the coding begins. So if you want to skip ahead, do that. As well, I recommend 2x speed on some of these parts too. You can learn twice as fast if you do that. But let's talk a little bit about what MVC is to begin with. MVC says that when you're building an application, it makes a lot of sense to separate it into three components: model, view, and controller. Now, the idea is the model represents the data that the client is after, right? A client never makes a request to a server or a request to an application without wanting some data back. So the data that they want is the model. Okay. Now, how do we get the model? Well, when the client makes a request, we have a controller that handles the request. The controller handles the incoming request, takes a look at what the client is requesting, maybe accesses any data that was submitted with the request. We can look at form data, request parameters, headers, but we want to find out what the request is, what the user is requesting. And that's the job of the controller. And so what does the controller do? Well, it takes a look at the request, figures out what's being requested, maybe interacts with some back-end resources, maybe calls on some services or even Java beans to do some processing. And once it's done that, it's got the data that the user needs, and it stuffs that data into this hypothetical thing that we call a model. And actually in Spring Boot, it's not hypothetical, it's actually an object. But we stuff all the data into the model, and then we pass that model to the view. for presentation. So the view layer takes a look at what's in the model and then presents it to the user. And that's the idea of model view controller. Now, one example for MVC that I always like to talk about, which emphasizes the benefits of MVC and how MVC should work. So the benefits are things like loose coupling, pluggability, ability to independently develop the model, view, or controller, and that also means being able to independently test them. I always like to talk about a home heating system, right? You know, like in your house, the thermometer is the controller, right? You want to increase the temperature, decrease the temperature, you know, you use that thermostat. That's the controller. And what happens when you change that thermostat? Well, the back-end resources kick in. That back-end resource might be the furnace, right? And it turns on. Or it could be an air conditioner. If you're in Texas, it turns on, maybe brings the temperature down. So that controller takes input from the user. The thermostat takes input from the user. Do you kids even know what this is? Like a thermostat that goes like that? You probably just press buttons. Back when I was a kid, we did that with the thermostat. So the model ends up becoming just what the temperature in the house is, right? Like, you know, you turn it up, but that's the model. That's what you're affecting. That's the data that you're after. And so the model in this situation is really just the temperature in the house. And then what's the view? Well, in this scenario, the view could be a number of things. It could just be what the temperature says on a thermostat. It could be maybe one of those cool like Newton's thermometer things with the different colored bubbles that go up and down depending on what the temperature is. The view could simply be the number of sweaters that my sister is wearing, or maybe she's just wearing shorts and a t-shirt because it's really, really warm. That is a view into the model as well. Now, the other thing to emphasize here is just think about how pluggable each of these things are in this scenario. I can take that old thermometer or that old thermostat that I have, and I can take it out and plug in a brand new cool Google Nest thermometer, right? A Google Nest thermostat. But that doesn't affect the back end. That's independent of the back end. It certainly doesn't affect the view. I can take out my gas furnace and put in a heat pump. Okay, that doesn't affect the view. It doesn't really affect the model, although I mean it does have the ability to change the model by turning on and turning off. And certainly, if I change the thermostat or I change the furnace, it doesn't affect the view. Right? It doesn't have any impact on what type of sweater my sister wears. I can go out and buy a new thermometer and put it on the wall. I can change out my Newton thermometer with something different, right? The view is completely pluggable. I can take one view, remove it, and replace it with another, and it's completely independent of the thermostat. It's completely independent of the furnace. So that's kind of the idea. When you think about model view controller like that, it really hits it home. Now, how are we going to build this application in Spring Boot? Well, what we're going to do in Spring Boot is we're going to create a Spring project that uses Spring Web. Spring MVC is inside the Spring Web Starter, the Spring Web project. We're going to create a class, and we're going to annotate that with the Spring Boot stereotype controller. That tells Spring Boot that it should handle incoming web requests to the client and route them into this controller, route them into methods into this controller. I'm going to add a get mapping on one of my methods that says anytime somebody says localhost 8080/play a game, anytime that comes in, what we'll do is we'll take a look at what they've selected in our rock, paper, scissors game, because that's what we're going to be creating here, a little rock, paper, scissors game. So it will say whether the client chose rock, paper, or scissors. And then depending on what they've chosen, we'll figure out whether it was a win, a loss, or a tie. So our controller is going to do a little bit of processing. It's also going to communicate with the back end. We're going to use a little bit of Spring data, and we're going to store the score in the database. And so every time we play a game, we'll pull the score out of the database. And if they win, increase the wins by 1. If they lose, increase losses by 1. If they tie, increase the ties by 1. So we're actually going to be doing a little bit of persistence as well. And then finally, when we get the data about whether it was a win, loss, or tie, or we get the score, how many wins, losses, and ties there are in total, we'll take that data, put it into a Spring object called the model, and then we'll call on a web page to be displayed. And we'll actually only provide the name of the page, not the extension, because we'll allow Spring Boot to figure out whether it should go to a page that renders HTML or JSON or XML or whatever the client might want. And in our case, what we're going to forward to is a time leaf page. It looks like an HTML page, but with special tags inside of it that can pull data from the model and help us present it. And so that time leaf component, that templating engine, is going to be our view component. So the Spring controller acts as the controller. We'll do some processing, pull some data from the back end, and take the results of that, stuff it into a Spring model object, pass that to a time leaf page to do presentation. The time leaf page will pull data out of the model, present it, and send it back to the client. And that will be our Spring MVC application. And building that is what we're going to do next. So the first step in this Spring MVC tutorial is to actually get a Spring Boot project up. Now, you can use the Spring initializer and then bring your code into IntelliJ or VS Code. I've actually got Eclipse installed here with the Spring tools in it. So my initializer comes up just by clicking Create New Spring Starter Project, which is exactly what I'm going to do. For me, I've always been a big Maven fan. So select Maven. The name of my project is going to be Rochambeau. That's apparently a term used around the world for rock, paper, scissors. My group and my package will be com.mcnz.rps, and the packaging type is going to be jar. I think with all of that entered in, I can just click Next and then select the Spring projects that I want to include in this application. Now, if you're just doing Spring MVC, the only thing that you really need is Spring Web and a template engine. So just scroll right down to the bottom there using the invisible scroll bars. They actually don't become visible until you open it up a little bit. So there we go. You can see Web right at the bottom. And I'm going to choose Spring Web. Now, along with Spring Web, you do need a templating engine to generate a view after the controller has done its work and we've stuffed a bunch of data into the model. And the most popular one with Spring Boot is Timeleaf. So I'm going to select that as well. Now, whenever you're working in Spring Boot, always, always, always add the developer tools. So I'm going to add in the Spring Boot Dev Tools. And after we've completed this application, I'd actually like to do some Spring Data JDBC. Just connect to a database so you can see a Spring MVC application using Spring Data, using JDBC. So I'm going to mosey on over here. You don't have to do this for Spring MVC, but I just thought it would be interesting. I'm going to include Spring Data JDBC, and I'm also going to include the H2 database, which is a easy embedded database that makes doing data persistence real easy. Okay, with that selected, I'm just going to click Finish. You'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner, it'll take a few minutes for the code to kind of compile, for Maven to do the build, perhaps even pull things down from Maven Central. But once that status bar in the bottom right-hand corner goes away, you can go over to your tool and start writing some code. Now, right in this com.mcnz.rps folder, you'll notice that there is already one class created. That class is the Rochambeau application. You'll notice that it is annotated with Spring Boot application. It's got a main method. That becomes the heart of our application. What we do as developers is we add classes and we annotate them, and the Spring inversion of control container will figure out when to call those classes. Now, one of the things our application wants to do is handle requests that come in from web-based clients and play an interactive rock, paper, scissors game with them. So I'm going to create a class here in my com.mcnz.rps folder, and I'm just going to call it Web Controller. And I'm calling it that because this is a class that's going to control requests that come in across the internet. So that is going to be created. Now, if you want the Spring framework to pay attention to the classes that you create, you've got to put some annotations. You've got to decorate these classes with some Spring annotations to just say to the Spring framework, hey, this is something important here. And specifically, this is going to be a Spring controller. And so you just annotate it with @controller. Of course, I got to organize my imports here. The tool doesn't know what the heck I'm talking about with this whole controller thing. So I say organize imports, and boom, you can see that controller stereotype is added. Now, that annotation lets Spring know that this is going to try and handle some requests that come in from a client. Those requests that come in are going to get mapped to individual methods. So for example, if someone says localhost :8080 / play a game, that should go to a method in this class. And specifically, it's a method that will return a string, and we'll call it play. We'll call it play game. I don't like the in there. So there we go. This will be the logic for playing a rock, paper, scissors game. Specifically, somebody will call this by saying localhost /8080 to map this method to a URL, to a resource, to the end of a URL. What we do is we add this thing called a GetMapping, and we say if anybody comes in saying localhost :8080 / play a game, it'll get routed into this play game method. That's sort of how the controller works. We put annotations on methods. We specify how someone will invoke this through their URL, through the resource part of the URL. And when this application runs, Spring Boot, whenever it sees somebody coming in on /play a game, it's going to route that request to this method. Now, again, I got a little error there. Do you see that red X? Okay, if you see a red X, you got to get your eyes checked because that is not a red X. That is a white X on a red background. But again, I'm just missing my import. So right-click, source, organize those imports, and boom, life is good. Well, it's not that good. We do actually have an error still. And that error is simply because this method that I created says that it returns a string, but right now there's no string being returned in it at all. And I am going to return a string. Now, the string that you return here is a piece of text that the Spring MVC framework will map to a template, map to an HTML file, map to a resource that will take data sent to it, format it nicely, and send it back to a client. So we're going to create a page called results.html, and that results.html page will display the results of a rock, paper, scissors game. And so to tell the Spring MVC framework, hey, go find the results.html file, you just return from this method, in quotes, results. And the Spring framework will take that word and then it will map that to a resource, in this case named results.html. So you're probably thinking, where is this results.html page supposed to go? Well, you know what? It just goes inside that template folder under resources. So the next thing I'm going to do here is create a page called results.html. So you're starting to see the flow, right? Someone says localhost :8080 / play a game. It goes to this method here. As we iterate over this project, we'll start adding more and more intense logic. But for now, we'll just imagine some logic's being done there, and then we figure out, okay, when the logic's done, we need to send somebody to the results page. So return results there at the end of the method. We're going to create a new file. I'll call it results.html. And this is the page that we are going to send users to when the the controller finishes its processing. And, you know, we have to do that requisite hello world. So we'll type in hello world. We are in the results page. And you know what, we probably should have some good HTML here, right? Like we should have HTML. Okay, you get the idea, just formatting it properly and making it look good. But right now, we've got everything in place to get a basic Spring MVC request response cycle working. So if I just click Control S, I come over to my project and I say, run as a Spring Boot application. The code will run. And then I need to bring up a browser of my own. So here's my browser. And when we come over here, we can say localhost :8080/play a game. And when we type that in, boom, it says hello world. We are in the results page. So you see that being displayed. And of course, play a game maps to the /play a game in the GetMapping. And so you're starting to see that request response cycle all coming together here, right? So with Spring MVC, we have controllers. Controllers have methods in them. The methods get mapped to from a URL. So when Spring Boot sees a specific URL, like play a game come in, it will send the request into this method for processing. And when this method is done, it figures out what HTML page to send to a client to, simply by returning a text string that has the name of the root of that page. That's a very basic flow. So there you go. Pat yourself on the back if you got that working. One thing I would mention, it's results, plural. Just be careful. Sometimes people create an HTML page called result.html, and then they return results. And if it doesn't match exactly, you end up with an error. But if you've got all of that working, well, I'm telling you, you just did the first big step in getting a Spring MVC application working. But we're going to up our game a little bit next by adding in a model, adding in some query parameters, and maybe even adding in some Nobel Prize winning logic. That is what we're going to do next. So we've got a very handsome Spring MVC Hello World application working right now, but I think we need to level up our game just a little bit. And here's how I'd like to do it. I'd like to level up our game in two different ways. One, I'd like to take input from the user, and two, I'd actually like to introduce the Spring model part of Model View Controller, stuff some information into that model, and then pass the model to our view component, our results.html page, and have Timeleaf do some interesting stuff with that model data and format our page nicely for our client. But to start, what I want to do is I want to take input from the user. There's a variety of ways that you can get input from the user. One is simply by pulling information off of the URL. With any URL, you can add a query parameter, or a Spring Boot, Spring MVC refers to it, a request param. And a request param is just a name value pair that goes at the end of a URL. So if I say localhost :8080/play a game takes us into our method, and then question mark choice equals rock, that will send choice equals rock as a name value pair to the server. And my Spring MVC application can pull that information out, store that information, the fact that somebody's chosen rock, in a local variable, and then I can do processing on that information. Here's how you do it. It's super easy. All you have to do is go in here and add request param. Okay, so I want a request parameter. I want to pull out a request parameter. Yeah, might need to say what the name is. So the name equals choice. I think that looks right. And of course, there you go. The choice equals rock. So the name in there is choice. Now, with Spring, we have to have some variable in here that rock, paper, scissors is going to map to. It's just string text. We'll call it the choice. And I'm calling it the choice instead of just choice, just to make it different from the data coming in from the request parameter on the URL and the variable used inside of my code. So this now gives me the choice. Now, the other thing that I want to do in this code is I actually want to take information and put that information into a Spring model object that can be passed to the view so the view can do some work on it. And so the other thing that I'm going to do in this method here is say, you know what, Spring MVC, add that precious model object to this method so that I can put data into this model and then pass it to the view component for rendering. Now I do have a couple of white X's there. That's because model and request param needs to be imported. So a little source, organize imports, get used to doing Control-Shift-O. That brings them in automatically. And I do want the Spring Frameworks model, not the Hollywood model. Control-S, and it looks like everything is working well. Now, did the choice really come in from the URL? Well, one way to find out is maybe by displaying the choice on the HTML page that gets sent back to the client. We can say, hey, you chose rock. How would we do that? Well, we'd have to pass that information, the choice, to the view component. And the way we do that is by adding Java beans into the model. So if we just wanted to have our view component say, hey, you chose rock, hey, you chose scissors, what we would do is we take the choice and add it to the model by saying model.add attribute. And the attribute is going to be, we're going to give it the name your choice. And I'm doing this just to make it a little different so that we don't see the same variables all over the place, right? So your choice, the choice, choice. And your choice is the choice that came into this method, right? Whether you picked rock, paper, or scissors. So now I've got information from the user. I've also taken that information, I've stuffed it into the model. The next thing to do is go to the view component that's doing display and have it display your choice. So let's go over here to our results.html page. I do have a couple of little things I have to do here. First of all, this page is going to be using something called the TimeLeaf template engine. So you're supposed to declare the XML namespace up here. This XML namespace th equals http://www.timeleaf.org. I think I spelled that right. Okay, so that's just some requirements there. But over here, we could add in, we could do something like, we could say, apparently you chose, and I'll put this in a span tag here. And what did they choose? Well, we're going to pull out what they chose from what they stuffed into this variable here. So the model has a variable called your choice. Okay, so we're going to pull out your choice. So the TimeLeaf should be able to find in the model your choice. Oh boy, I do dislike the autocomplete there. Okay, that ends the span tag. And so now in our view component, we're saying, hey, let's go into the model and find that value, find that text string that was shoved into the model with the name your choice. And if you can't remember where that is, well, there it is, right there. Okay, so now we're getting input from the user. We've got a model of our Spring MVC, model view controller. We're putting data into that model, and now we're asking our template, our TimeLeaf template, our results page to display that data in some sort of markup where it looks interesting. Okay, let's save this. Control S. I think I can right click on my project and say run as a Spring Boot application. I'm going to monitor those log files to make sure that there's no errors in there. It does look good to me. I'm going to come over to this page and you can see that choice equals rock. Click enter and boom, apparently you chose rock. And I can play this game all day. I can change this now. Paper, scissors, and Spock. So there you go. Now we're getting information from the client. Well, given we're not doing too much with it for now, but we are passing it into the model and doing display of that information in a more meaningful way. But we don't want to just display back rock, paper, scissors, Spock, or lizard to the user. We want to say, you won, you lost, it was a tie. And so that is what we're going to implement next. So I think our application is looking pretty good right now, but there is one thing that I think is bitterly missing, and that's the fact that in our play game method, we're not actually doing any processing with any of the data that we're getting in here. We're trying to implement a rock, paper, scissors game. So what we need to do is we need to take the user's choice and figure it out whether it was a win, a loss, or a tie. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit here. I'm going to assume that the server always chooses rock. I think Kramer did that in Seinfeld. He said he always chose rock. That's just going to make the logic a little bit easier here. If you want to randomly choose rock, paper, scissors on the server and do the logic for that, I'll give you bonus points for that. But for me, I'm just going to assume that the server always chooses rock. And then from that, I'm going to figure out what the outcome was of the game. After I get the outcome, I'm going to stuff that outcome in the model and then present that to the user by using some time leaf templates on my results page. So starting off, I do need a variable to represent the outcome. And I'll say the outcome is equal to a tie, because I'll just assume that the client chose rock as well. But if they didn't choose rock, so if the choice dot equals ignore case, and if that equals ignore case paper, well, in that case, the result is a win, right? Paper beats rock, and it's not result, it's the outcome, sorry. And then what's the last one that we've got to do there? So the tie just assumes that they chose rock. If it is, we won't do any of these if conditions. If the choice is paper, then it's a win. And if the choice is scissors, it's a loss. And we are going to assume that they typed this in properly. We're not going to deal with things typed in incorrectly. We can deal with that later. But now we've got some logic, right, for our application. So if the user types in paper, it's going to be a win for them. If they type in rock, it's a tie. And if they type in scissors, it's a loss. We've now got the outcome stored in a variable. We would like to display to the user, hey, you won. Hey, it was a loss. In order to do that, in order to get that information, we need to stuff that outcome variable into our model. And so that's what we do down here. It's just copy and paste, but it's not your choice. It is going to be the outcome, and it's not the choice, it's the outcome. Okay, we're using the same name as the variable there. I'm trying to do it differently from one spot to another, just to kind of show you how things connect together and stuff like that. But so now we're putting the variable into the model using the same name as the variable this time. That should pass the outcome to our to our view component. And we should be able to say, hey, the result of playing the game was this, that, or the other thing. So I'll throw a little break tag in there. And I'll say the result of playing the game was, and here we'll throw a little span tag on there, a little copy and paste. but it's not your choice. It's going to be the name that we stuffed in there. That's the outcome. And there we go. The result of playing the game was the outcome. So I'm going to click Control S here. And then I'm going to right click on my application and say Run as a Spring Boot app. That's going to kick things off again, get everything reloaded. And then, as my fingers are crossed, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to take a look at the choice. Choice equals rock. And it says the result of playing the game was a tie. I go in here, I say paper. It says the result of playing a game was a win. And scissors. The result of playing the game was a loss. And so there you go. We are now in a more meaningful way really playing this rock, paper, scissors game. Now I might actually just get rid of some of that stuff up top there, make it look a little bit more handsome. But I think our application is going really, really well. Now, the next thing that we might add to this is actually a nice little web page. So if you want to have a web page where it says, you know, what will it be, rock, paper, or scissors, you can go up to this static folder here. That folder is where all of the files that stick to your clothes when you pull them out of the dryer go. It's a file that doesn't have any time leaf or rendering or anything crazy. It just will display like HTML. That's why it's static. I can create a file called index.html because every page should have an index.html file. And I'm just going to do the basics here. HTML, body. We should have that head tag and title. This is my Rochambeau app. Okay, we'll just putting in the things that are needed. And this is basically what I'll do. So I'll put a little paragraph tag here and say, what will it be? Question mark, question mark, question mark. And then after that, I'm going to add an anchor tag. And the anchor tag is going to link to / play a game question mark choice equals rock. And that will put in rock there. Boy, I really dislike all of this type ahead stuff. And I'll throw a little break tag in there. I'm just going to take a look at this. href equals play a game. And play a game maps exactly. Play a game there has to match exactly that. And choice has to map exactly to that. So that all looks good. So that will give them the option to select rock. This will give them the option to select paper. And this final one will give them the option to select scissors. And I think that looks like a nice little static HTML page. We don't need the XML namespace equals time leaf because there won't be any processing, any template engine stuff going on here. It's just pure HTML. But this will generate a link that we can click on that will route the request to our controller, because /play a game is what maps the request to that method in the controller. Rock, paper, scissors will be passed in, the processing will occur, and then finally we'll go to that results.html page for rendering of the information. So I'm going to click Control S. Okay, that makes sure that the file is saved. Make sure all of your files are saved. Then I'm going to come over here, and the Spring Dev tool should be rebooting this, but I always like to say run as Spring Boot app. Anyways, as that boots up, I'm going to head over to my application, and I'm just going to go localhost 8080. I'm not even going to say index.html because that should just be the default. Oh, and I get a white label error, index.html. Okay, I don't know why I got the white label error there, but just ignore that. Okay, and what will it be? Rock, paper, or scissors? Let's try rock. Ooh, it was a tie. Let's try paper. Oh, we won. Let's try scissors. It was a loss. I'm going to go back to paper again and make sure, hey, that paper is winning. There we go. So I don't know. I think now we're actually creating a pretty cool Spring MVC application. We have the static web page. That's this page here. That's index.html, which says, what will it be? After that, when we click on rock, paper, or scissors, well, through a query parameter, a request parameter, that data is sent to the server. We get Spring Boot to transfer that data that's part of the query parameter into a variable that we can use in our method called the choice. We've also passed the model into this method so that we can stuff it with Java beans that can be sent to the view. We perform some Nobel Prize winning logic here, and then once we've got the outcome, we stuff it in the model. We know what the user's choice was, we stuff that in the model, and then we just say to Spring MVC framework, go find the renderer that corresponds to results. Since this is fairly simple, Spring MVC knows to map results to results.html. Things can get a little bit funkier if you've got different client types and crazier types of mapping of the response. But for the most part, you'll see the word that gets returned here mapped to an HTML page in your templates folder. That then goes to this results.html page, and we use a little bit of time leaf syntax here to pull out your choice and to pull out the income. And there you go. That results in this Spring MVC page, server-side rendering with Java that allows us to play a simple little rock, paper, scissors game. That's it for Spring MVC, but most people want to actually see how Spring MVC might link to a database. So if you want to quickly see how we can get this application to update a database and keep track of the wins, losses, and ties, stick around. I think you'll find the next section very, very interesting. Okay, I would like to seriously up the intensity. If you just wanted to learn about Spring MVC and everything so far is very understandable and you're not interested in Spring data or connecting to a database, then you know what? Like this video, subscribe, and tune out. But most people want to see how a Spring Boot application, a Spring MVC application, maybe connects to a database and does persistence. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to introduce Spring Data JDBC and show you how easy it is to persist data to a database. Now, there is a number of steps to this, so it's fairly complicated. I want to keep track of the score, the number of wins, losses, and ties. So I'm going to need a Java bean called score. That's going to persist to a database. So I need something called a score repository that extends CRUD repository from Spring. I'm going to have to include that in my controller, and I'm also going to have to create maybe a little SQL file to just create a database in H2. So there's a lot going on, and if all you wanted to learn about was Spring MVC and you think this might confuse you, I'm not going to take it personally if you stop the video now. But if you just want to see how data persistence works with Spring, follow along. I think you'll find it interesting. Okay, I want to keep track of the score. Now, Spring, Java, it's object-oriented. So if you want to keep track of the score, the number of wins, losses, and ties, and even persist that in the database, you create an object that represents that score. So over here in my package, I'm going to create a brand new class. I'm just going to call it score. Like, it's not going to be anything too interesting. And it's going to have 3 ints, right? Wins, losses, and ties. Right? It's just going to keep track of the wins, losses, and ties. Now, it's a Java bean, so we have to generate the requisite setters and getters, right? So you can right click, say generate setters and getters, and it'll do that. And I also like to have a constructor, so I'm going to create a constructor. So you can say source. What is that? Constructor using fields. And then from there, I'll create a constructor that includes wins, losses, and ties. So there you go, your constructor's made. I don't like the constructor to be above the variable declaration, so we'll add that in. But right now, this is actually a really simple Java class. It's the score, and it contains the wins, losses, and ties for an ongoing game. We could even say this is like the global score that keeps track of all the wins, losses, and ties for this use case. So lots of constructors and setters and getters in there, but really it just has those properties. Now we will be persisting this to a database, and if you're going to persist an object to the database, you have to have a primary key. So I'm going to have a primary key of type integer called ID, and you put this little annotation on the top there. You say this is a special database primary key. Organize my imports. There we go. That ID annotation is imported, and you get the idea. Things are looking good. Okay, so that's our score class. That's going to represent the score. Now, if you want to persist data to a database, well, in order to make that happen, what you have to do is well, you don't have to, but one of the ways to do it is to create a class that extends CRUD repository, and you specify the primary key and the object type that you want to do persistence with. And so I'm going to create a class. Oh, I've got a little error here. Let me just fix my error first. Okay, the error's gone away. I didn't save the file. I saw a little white X in a red circle there, and I was like, hey, what's that? But the next thing we need to do is just create something called a score repository. This is an object. This is a class that is going to allow us to do persistence. It's going to provide us methods for saving and finding and deleting records in the underlying database. And so I'll call that score repository. It does actually have to extend something. So it has to extend. So it extends. Oh, and you know what? It's not a class. It's an interface. And it has to extend this interface CRUD repository. Okay? And that CRUD repository is genericized. Specifically, this CRUD repository is going to take care of a score, and the primary key is of type integer. Okay, so you have to create this repository class that extends this repository interface that extends CRUD repository. And this is magically going to give you a bunch of features that will allow your code to persist to a database. Now, I am going to do Control-Shift-O here. Control-Shift-O organizes all my imports. But now I've got this score class. I've got the score repository interface that extends CRUD repository from Spring. The CRUD repository is going to know how to save, delete, and find score objects given integers passed in as the primary key. And I guess the next thing I want to do is just integrate that into my code. I want to be able to just get an instance of the score class. And what else do I need to do? Maybe increase the number of wins, increase the number of losses, and increase the number of ties. So coming back over here to my web controller, I'm actually going to create a new mapping that just gets the score. And so this mapping is going to be a get mapping. And if somebody just says /score, so localhost 8080/score, that should just return the score to the user. So that's going to be a little get mapping. So get mapping /score, and that'll go to a public method that returns the score called get score. And of course, this has to return score, which it hasn't done yet, which is why we've got the little white X in the red circle. Okay, now this is going to get the score. I'm going to do a little razzle dazzle here. In order to get the score, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first try and find a record in the database with primary key 1. So we'll just say that the score is always the first record in the database. And if I don't have that, I'm going to create a new score. Now, in order to do that, I need the services of that score repo. And so in the web controller, I'm just going to auto wire in that score repo. So That way, the Spring framework has created the score repo properly, passed it in. Now I've got access to all of the methods associated with it. I have to do little source organized imports here to make my errors go away for the auto-wired at least. And now in this getScore class, what I can do is I can try and find the score. So I'm going to say score, so just declare the variable. And then I'm going to try to get the score from the score repository. So I'll say score equals score repo dot, and you can see all of those persistence related methods in there: find all, find by ID, delete, save. I want the find by ID method, and this needs an integer, so I'll say new integer and the number 1. We'll just say that the first record is always the global score, which we're going to be updating. So that tries to get the first record in the database. And of course, I'm just going to do a catch here, and we'll catch exception E. That's kind of lazy. But this line here will throw an exception if there is no record in the database. So if there's no record in the database, we're not really going to log that. What we're going to do is we're just going to create a new score object, score equals new score. And I don't know, 11, 22, 33 for wins, losses, and ties. I don't know. And then after creating the score, we'll say score repo dot save the score. And now everything looks pretty good. I do have an error here. What is the error on this line? The constructor int has been deprecated since version. Okay, we know that type mismatch cannot convert from optional score to score. And so find by ID, new integer. Oh, and find by ID, new integer. And once we've got that, we have to actually call this get method. Okay, so that gets me the score. Sorry, I forgot that little piece there. But now we say in this getScore method, hey, let's get the score from the database. If the score is not the first record there, if that first record doesn't exist, well, let's create a new score object and then save it into that database. We're assuming if it's a clean database, there won't be any other records there. Now, that just gets us the score. It doesn't update it yet, but we got to walk before we can run. Oh, by the way, right here, this method is looking for a score object to be returned. So we need to return the score. I'm actually going to do something a little bit interesting here. I'm actually going to skip the rendering phase. Rather than having an HTML page or a template page to render the score, I just want to send it back to the client as JSON. I don't want to do any rendering. If you want to skip the rendering process, what you can do is you can put this annotation ResponseBody on your code, Control-Shift-O to organize imports. And what that'll do is that will skip the rendering phase and instead just take what's returned from this method, the score, turn it into JSON, embed that JSON in the body of the response, and send it right back to the client. So that's what it should do, at least. Let's see if it does. So let's see if we can get this score working. Now, by the way, we are using the H2 database. And so in your POM file, and I added these right at the beginning, but in the POM file, you'll notice that I've got a reference to data JDBC and also to H2. Now, where is that H2 database? There it is right there, H2 database. And that's going to be an embedded database that I can use as I test my application. So make sure you've got those two in there. Okay, and now the other thing I need to do is just make sure that database is created as the application starts up. And if you want to make sure that the application is created right when it starts up, all you have to do is go into this resources folder and create a new file and call it schema.sql. Make sure I spelled it correctly. And in that schema.sql file, you simply type in, well, in this case, it's your create statement. So I'm going to say create table score. ID integer auto increment not null, wins integer not null, losses integer not null, ties integer not null, and the primary key is ID. By typing all that into the schema.sql file, what ends up happening is when Spring Boot starts up, it's going to connect to the H2 database and create that database table for us. So that creates the table. And now you'll notice then when our application runs and somebody asks for the score, well, when they go in and get the score, if the score is null and there's no record at 1, we create a new one and save it. If there is a record at 1, we just get it, okay? And when we created 11, 22, and 33. So when we run this for the first time and say /score, that's what should come back to us. Okay, let's give it a try. I'm going to go over here. Oh, what did I do in my POM file? I'm not sure why my POM file is acting up on me, but I'm going to assume that everything is just fine and say run as a Spring Boot application. POM files can be so finicky. It is actually one of the things that annoys me, how they can sometimes have these errors on them when in fact there aren't really any errors there at all. But let's see what happens now. I'm going to come back to my application, localhost 8080/score. And when I say /score, look what comes back to me. Wins 11, losses 22, and ties 33. So it's actually calling that score method. It recognized that there was nothing in that database. And even though it realized that there was nothing in that database, well, it said, hey, I'm going to create a new record for you. So you can actually see, there we go, 11, 22, and 33. We're actually getting that data back. Now, by the way, this is how you implement RESTful APIs and RESTful web services with Spring Boot. You typically add that ResponseBody annotation on top, and you skip that whole rendering phase and instead just send back JSON or XML if the client wants it. By the way, that's actually what the REST controller does as well. So a lot of people say, what's the difference between REST controller and controller? REST controller just automatically puts ResponseBody on all of the methods. It's the assumed thing. It skips that rendering phase. Spring MVC, we love that rendering phase though. Okay, that's pretty cool. The next step is to actually add some logic to our code so that when somebody wins, the number of wins goes up. When somebody loses, the number of losses goes up. When somebody ties, the number of ties goes up. Once we do that, I think we've got a pretty solid Spring MVC, Spring Data, Spring Boot application on our hands. But enhancing this, that is what we're going to do next. Okay, we're really pulling this Spring MVC, Spring JDBC data application together. I said there wasn't actually going to be any more Spring MVC, but actually I am going to add a little bit of Spring MVC to the application. What I'd like to do right now is go into this play a game method. And what I want to do is I want to actually increase the number of wins or number of losses or number of ties depending on whether the game was won, the game was lost, or the game tied. And so in order to do that, what I need to do is I need to first declare a variable, call it score, and I'll call it score equals this dot score. Okay, so we're going to get the score. So this gets the score right off the bat. And then if somebody wins, well, what are we going to do? We're going to say score.set wins. So somebody says paper, and that's a win. So, and that would be score.get wins plus plus, right? Or is it plus one? Get plus plus on the method. So if somebody wins, okay, we get the number of wins, we add 1 to it, and then we set that as the new number for the wins. If they tie, the logic's going to look very similar. So, but it's not wins, it's losses. Get losses plus 1. Oh boy, it looks like we may have to do paper, scissors. We may have to do the if condition for the rock, right? So there we go. If rock get ties. Okay, does that look good? win, loss, tie. I think everything is going swimmingly right there. So we get the score. After we get the score, if it's a tie, we increase the ties. If it's a win, we increase the wins by 1. If it's a loss, we increase the losses by 1. But we also want to display the score, right? Like that score is some data. Remember I said that when we have a controller, we take input from the user, we do some processing, we get a result, and then we send that result to the view for display. Right now, the result is the score. That's what somebody wants to see. And in order to get that to the view, we have to stuff that into the view. So model.add attribute. I'm just going to copy and paste because I'm lazy. There we go. Model add attribute. And we're just going to add the score in there, right? So we take that score and we're just going to add it right into the model. And then our page should be able to display it. Now I'm actually going to scroll up here just in case you were wondering where the getScore method came from. We created that a moment ago. Now we do have a GetMapping on it, ResponseBody, so that it's RESTful. But just because it's a method annotated with a GetMapping URL doesn't mean we can't call it directly, right? Like it's still just another method in the class. So that's the getScore, which gets the score object for us from the database. And then we go into our play the game method and we get the score, and then if it's a win, we update wins, ties, and losses. Now we do add that score right there inside of the model. So we say model.add attribute. And so why don't we come over to the results page and display that information? So apparently you chose that. The result of playing that was that. I'll do a little break tag there. Boy, I hate this autocomplete. Okay. And so what we'll say is we'll say, hey, here's the number of wins. And then span th text. I'm just going to copy and paste here because I'm lazy. But it's not your choice. It's going to be score.wins, right? Okay, and then we'll throw a pipeline in there, losses, and that is going to be score.losses. And I'll throw another pipeline in there. You know, I can do that after the pipeline. That's a pipeline there. I don't know what else you might call it. But wins, losses, ties, and then it's just score.ties. We'll line that up a little bit so it looks nice and handsome there. Wins, score.wins, losses, score.losses, and ties, score.ties. And of course, where does score come from? Well, the controller stuffed that into the model, right? We got the score up here. When we were done with it, we stuffed it right into the model. We then told the Spring MVC framework to go find the renderer, go find the view component that maps to results. Everything's basic here, so it's just results.html that it goes to. And then it's going to display the wins, losses, and ties. Score.wins, score.losses, and score.ties. And of course, that's just the setters and getters that it's calling in this class here. Okay, how does it work? That is the million-dollar question. It looks like that POM file is causing that white X, but pay it no mind. Maven just likes to throw you off your game a little bit from time to time, but there's nothing wrong with my Maven file. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to take a look at the score. So first of all, check the score. That is working. Now I'm going to go over to index.html. I was going to do play a game, but we don't need to do that. What will it be? Rock, paper, or scissors? I'll say rock. Okay, there we go. Wins 34. Paper. Losses 22. Ties 33. Losses 23. Wins 11. Losses 33. Oh, and you know what? This isn't working. It's not working because after I put the score in there, I didn't update the score. So that's silly me. Right at the end of this method, after we figured out the score, we need to save it. Score repo dot save the score. Okay, that's important. Right? Save the score. Sorry about that. One line of code missed. Okay, and you know what? I'm actually going to, well, I'll click refresh here. So we start off and we've got wins is 34. Now we select paper. Wins is 35. Paper again. Wins is 36. Rock ties 33. Rock ties 33. Why is that going 33? Okay, so rock ties. The outcome equals tie. Win, loss. Let me go to my score object here. Wins, losses. Okay, that's actually a good thing to know, right? So it's, no, score.losses, score.ties, score.wins, losses, and ties. Okay, so that all looks good. Let's just do some live troubleshooting here. Wins, losses, and ties. And then in my web controller, get ties plus 1. Get wins plus 1, get losses plus 1. Oh, look at that. Set wins, set losses. So that should be set ties. Okay, a little live troubleshooting here. Okay, now let's come over here. What will it be? Rock. That tells me that it's a tie, so that's 34. Now a rock again, 35. Paper should be a win, wins 12. No, paper, yeah, wins 13, wins 14. And then scissors is a loss, loss is 23, loss is 24. Now, by the way, I actually don't want the breaks there. Again, I want pipelines. I like pipelines better. I'm just going to make that little change there, come over to my page, and I think this is going to look really, really handsome. What will it be? Rock. Okay, wins, losses. Ties keeps going up, but let's increase the wins. Let's get the wins up to 20. But you get the idea. I mean, we can sit here and we can play this game all day long. And the reason we can do that is because it's supported by behind the scenes by Spring Boot and Spring MVC technology. Okay, I think that was a pretty good whirlwind. Let's take a look at, there's index.html. There's the results.html page. Why don't I tighten that up just a little bit there. Other key components here, the score class, score repository, and then finally this beautiful web controller that, I don't know, brings it all home, right? The controller annotation, auto-wired. We saw the response body annotation to help us support RESTful API development. And then we saw the get mapping for the play a game, which does a bunch of logic, takes input from the user, and then finally returns, in this case, results, which causes the result.html page to be rendered. I think overall, that is a pretty darn impressive little Spring MVC application that takes advantage of Spring Boot configuration and also takes advantage of Spring Data JPA as well and the H2 database. Okay, that's it. I am done. But I will say, you know, if you're interested in following me on Twitter, at CameronMC is my handle. I've got a few books that I've written. You can see them in the background there. Hibernate Made Easy. What is WebSphere? That's not selling too well anymore. And also a little book called Pickering is Springfield, so feel free to check that out. Also, I helped with editing on Darcy DeClute, Scrumptious on Twitter, her Scrum Master Certification Guide, and people are reading that book and scoring 100% on the Scrum Master and Product Owner exams, so check that out if you want to up your Agile game. And of course, I am the editor-in-chief over at TheServerSide. So we've got a bunch of other tutorials on Spring, on Spring Boot, on Scrum, on Agile, on Git, on DevOps over there. So please head over there and check it out. And then finally, of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, like, why don't you subscribe on YouTube?